Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Inshallah, in this video, you will be learning Madani Qaida lesson number 16. Lesson number 16, Tafkhim and Tarqiq. The meaning of Tafkhim is to pronounce the letter in a thick tone, and Tarqiq is to pronounce the letter in a thin tone. Next rule, Alif, Lam and Ra are sometimes pronounced in a thick tone and sometimes in a thin tone. Next rule, Alif. Alif will be pronounced in thick tone if it is preceded by a letter that is pronounced in thick tone, and it will be pronounced in thin tone when preceded by a letter that is pronounced in thin tone. Dear viewers, that means if you see any thick letter before alif, so alif will be thick, and if you see any thin letter before alif, so alif will be thin. For example, look at the first box in line 1. You can see qaf, thick letter before alif, because qaf is a mustaliya letter, thick letter. So alif will be thick. You have to read like this, qala. Look at the last box in line 1. You can see fa, thin letter before alif. So alif will be thin. You have to read like this, mafazan. Next rule, lam. If the letter before the lam of Isme Jalalat Allah has a zabar or pesh on it, then the lam of Isme Jalalat Allah will be pronounced in a thick tone, and if the letter before the lam of Allah's name, before the lam of Isme Jalalat Allah has a zair below it, then the lam of Isme Jalalat Allah will be pronounced in a thin tone. That means if you see zabar or pesh before the lam of Allah's name, you have to pronounce the lam with thick tone. And if you see zair before the lam of Allah's name, you have to pronounce the lam with thin tone. For example, look at the first box in line 3. You can see zabar before the lam of Allah's name. So you have to read the lam in a thick tone like this, Allahu. Now look at the first box in line 4. You can see pesh before the lam of Allah's name. So you have to read the lam in a thick tone like this, Rasulullahi. Now look at the last box in line 4. You can see zair before the lam of Allah's name. So you have to read the lam in a thin tone like this, Bismillahi. Next rule, every lam other than the lam of Isme Jalalat Allah will be pronounced in a thin tone. So if you see any lam in any other word, if it is not in the name of Allah, so the lam will be thin in every case. For example, look at the second box in line 5. You can see a lam in this word, and there is a zabar before lam. But this lam is not the lam of Allah's name. So you have to read it in a thin tone like this, Ma wallahum. Next rule, the conditions for when the letter Ra is pronounced in a thick tone. A, when it has a zabar or pesh on it. B, when it has two zabar or two pesh on it. C, when it has khadi zabar. D, when the letter before a ras hakina has a zabar or pesh. E, when there is a temporary zair before a ra sakina. F, when there is a zair before a ra sakina in the preceding word. G, when a letter of mustaliya comes after a ra sakina in the same word. That means if you see zabar or pesh on ra, you have to read ra with thick tone. If you see two zabar or two pesh on ra, you have to read ra with thick tone. If you see khada zabar on ra, you will be pronouncing in thick tone. If you see zabar or pesh before ra sakin, you have to pronounce ra sakin with thick tone. If you see a temporary zair before a ra sakin, you have to pronounce ra with thick tone. If you see a zair before a ra sakin in the preceding word, you have to pronounce ra with thick tone. And if you see any mustaliya letter after ra sakin in the same word, you have to read ra with thick tone. For example, look at the first box in line 1. You can see zabar on ra. You have to pronounce with thick tone like this, rajulun. Look at the second box in the same line. You can see zabar on ra, it is also thick. Look at the third box in the same line. You can see pesh on ra. You have to read with thick tone like ruziqu. Look at the second last box in the same line. You can see two zabar on ra. If you see the last letter, the last box in this line, you can see two pesh on top of ra. So in all of these cases, you have to pronounce ra with thick tone. And look at the next line. In first box, you can see khada zabar on top of ra. You have to pronounce with thick tone like Ibrahim. In the second box, you can see zabar before ra sakin. You have to pronounce with thick tone like Arshun. Look at the fourth box. In the same line, you can see pesh before ra sakin. You have to pronounce with thick tone. And look at the last box in this line. You can see a temporary zair before ra sakin. You have to pronounce ra with thick tone. What does temporary zair mean? So in the Holy Quran, some words start with alif, and alif has no haraka, no zabar, zair or pesh on it. If you put zair below alif, so that zair will be temporary zair. Now, next line, look at the fourth box. You can see a zair before ra sakin in the preceding word because Rabbi is the preceding word. After that, you can see ra sakin. So you have to read this ra sakin with thick tone. And in the next line, look at the second box. You can see a mustaliya letter qaf after ra sakin. You have to read ra sakin with thick tone like kullu firqin, like this. Inshallah, in the next video you will be learning rest of the rules of lesson number 16 and some lines of lesson number 16 from the beginning.